We also know that water would be very seriously impacted as a result of the changes in climate. And here let me make an observation. Climate change is not a smooth, steady increase in temperatures. It's not a linear change at all. It's going to be accompanied by several discontinuities and several extreme occurrences that clearly would disrupt the way life has been led in the past. Now here, what's particularly important is, again, to look at the figures for Africa. We expect that water stress would affect 75 to 250 million people in Africa. And I want to highlight the fact that climate change exacerbates a number of existing stresses. And we know that there are parts of the world that are suffering from a whole range of stresses, and climate change could really provide the means for essentially creating what you might call, in the wording of the Framework Convention on Climate Change, Article 2 in particular, a dangerous level of interference, anthropogenic interference with the climate system. But in contrast to all these impacts, if we look at means by which we can globally reduce the emissions and concentration of these gases, the picture actually represents an opportunity, a feasibility that we have to really seize upon. And here in this table you would see, as we've already been told by Ambassador Karim, that we have a very short window of opportunity. If we want to stabilize global mean temperature increase to between 2 to 2.4 degrees Celsius, we have only 6 years in which we can allow global emissions to increase, and beyond that they will have to decline. And the faster they decline, the greater the opportunity to avoid some of the worst impacts of climate change. And therefore, we really need to take in hand a whole range of adaptation measures as part of our development strategies. Because even if we bring emissions to zero today, the inertia in the system will continue with climate change for several decades into the future. And therefore, adaptation is inevitable. And this certainly needs a whole range of social and environmental issues that become an important part of the growth scenario for the future. And we would need a set of appropriate policies to bring about sustainable development and ensure that the impacts of climate change are minimized. Now, we are often told that the cost of mitigation will be ruinous for economic output as well as employment, but nothing could be further from the truth, because the scenario that I described to you a little while ago, in very general terms, really means that by 2030, the impact on the global economy would be a reduction at the most of 3% of the global GDP. And this also needs to be considered in the context that mitigation carries with it a whole range of co-benefits, much lower levels of air pollution at the local level and therefore health benefits, much higher levels of energy security, much greater employment, as we've heard in the case of the renewable energy industry, which employs 2.3 million people already, while contributing barely 2% to the total supply of energy. So I think there has to be a coherence between development strategies and the means by which we can move to a new set of energy supply and consumption patterns. Now, I'm not going to go into details of energy supply technologies, because this, I'm sure, will be discussed in the sessions that are going to take place. The only point I want to mention is the fact that in order to start mitigation at a stringent level, all the technologies that we need are available with us today or are likely to be commercialized in the very near future. Of course, we need policies, we need price signals, fiscal measures, and certainly a price on carbon by which we can develop new technologies in the future. But to embark on this journey, the technologies we need are available with us today. And the estimates of additional investments and financial flows required for mitigation clearly indicate that this is a very modest requirement. If you look at what is being spent in the bailout packages across the world to revive the economy globally and in different countries, this pales in comparison with that amount, because my estimate is that we are likely to spend $2.7 trillion for these bailout packages. But for something that really defines the welfare of humanity in the future, and in fact today, we don't seem to be willing to provide this kind of money. And if we continue on a business as usual basis, the demand for investments in the energy supply industry would be so huge, $26.3 trillion up to 2030, that it makes sense for us to look at alternative pathways by which this investment can be minimized. Now, here let me turn to another set of numbers. If you look at trends in investments, then sustainable energy investment was about $70 billion in 2006, which was an increase of 43%. Encouraging, but not adequate, because we started from a very small base. But however, I think renewable energy, for instance, is coming into its own, as these numbers will clearly indicate. I also want to mention that we need a price on carbon by which the right market signals can be created to bring about the shift, the revolution that has been referred to. I want to also mention that for business and industry, this represents an opportunity. And those companies that are willing to see that the world is moving to a low-carbon future and are therefore going to move in that direction themselves, success awaits them. Those that don't do so are clearly going to be the ones that would lose. I'll skip this in the interests of time, but I just want to mention that there is substantial economic potential for mitigation of global greenhouse gas emissions in the coming decades, and this is something that we have brought out very clearly in the IPCC Fourth Assessment Report. Now, I want to also mention that we need complete rethinking of global spending priorities, because if you look at the kind of flows that would be required to create a totally different set of supply options, particularly in the developing countries, it's a very small amount as compared to the kinds of subsidies. And that's only an example. If you look at the expenditure on arms and weaponry, it exceeds $1 trillion a year. So I think we need to bring about a political awareness among the leadership of the world that what we are playing with is the very future of this planet and the welfare of society, not only today, but that is yet to come. And we need, therefore, to move towards a low-carbon path of development. And the dominant path since industrialization has been clearly one that emphasizes fossil fuel use. We need to bring about a shift in the economic structure. And I want to emphasize that we also need to bring about a shift in lifestyles. I think no longer can we pretend that our lifestyles are sustainable. And this, as I mentioned earlier in the context of investments, is an encouraging trend, but not adequate. And finally, I want to quote Mahatma Gandhi, who said a technological society has two choices. It can either wait until you have catastrophic failures, expose systemic deficiencies, distortion, and most importantly, self-deception. Secondly, a culture can provide social checks and balances to correct for a systemic distortion prior to catastrophic failures. And I think we need to innovate. We need to think out of the box. And I think in the very context of development, we have to come up with new solutions. And I'd like to end by presenting something to you very briefly in a video that I hope can be screened now. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.